tutorial, we're going to talk about languages and dialects. So how many languages are there? The usual number given is up to about 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. But it's difficult to be certain exactly how many languages there are for a few reasons. We still don't know enough about the linguistic situation in some areas of the world, and it can be difficult to distinguish separate languages from dialects of a single language. So what is the difference between a language and a dialect? The term dialect is often misused to mean a non-standard variety of a language, or for indigenous languages spoken by small numbers of people, while many of these are actually separate languages. So the technical linguistic definition of the distinction between language and dialect involves the principle of mutual intelligibility. So if two groups of people speak differently from one another, but can still understand one another, then they're speaking different dialects of one language. However, if two groups of people speak differently from one another and they can't understand one another, then they're speaking different languages. So dialects are different but mutually intelligible varieties of a language. For example, if someone who speaks Australian English meets someone from the USA, they will notice that they speak differently. They'll have different pronunciations, use some different words, maybe even some different grammatical structures, but they can still understand each other. So American English and Australian English are different dialects of one language. But if someone who speaks Australian English meets someone from Germany, they will not be able to understand one another unless the Australian has learnt German or the German has learnt Australian. So German and Australian English are separate languages, even though they're very closely related. This definition of a dialect seems quite simple, but it's a bit more complicated than that because there is an exception to the general rule. If two groups don't understand one another, but there's an unbroken chain of people between them who do understand one another, then they are said by linguists to be speaking dialects in a continuum that belongs to a single language. For example, if someone from Sydney meets someone from Glasgow speaking Scottish English and someone from New Orleans speaking Louisiana English, they would have a lot of difficulty understanding one another. Does this mean that Australian, Scottish and Louisiana English are distinct languages? No, because each of these speech varieties are connected by a chain of speakers who can understand one another. For example, speakers in Northern England understand Scottish speakers, speakers in Southern England understand speakers in Northern England, speakers in Australia understand speakers in Southern England. So this is called a dialect continuum. There are several dialect continuums in Europe. We usually think there are many languages in Europe: French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and so forth. This is because each of these is associated with a different country, and each country has its own standard language. But most of the languages of Europe actually belong to just a few dialect continuums. So the languages we just mentioned, French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, belong to a dialect continuum we call Western Romance. It is a continuum because there is no point between Sicily at the bottom of Italy and Lisbon in Portugal where people in one region can't understand people in the neighbouring region, even across national boundaries like the boundary between France and Italy. There's no point where the chain of mutually intelligible dialects is broken. This makes it hard to come up with the exact number of languages that there are in the world. Should we count Spanish, Portuguese, French and Italian as separate, even though they belong to the Western Romance dialect continuum? If we do, then we're counting different dialects in the same dialect continuum as separate languages just because they're considered standard languages. But for most dialect continuums in the world, such as in Africa or Papua New Guinea, there's no dialect that is considered to be a standard dialect. So this means we'd be counting European languages differently by counting more of them than those in other parts of the world. If we do count French, Spanish, etc. as separate languages, should we also count Catalan spoken in southern Spain around Barcelona and Provençal spoken in southern France, which are as different as standard Spanish and standard French? Another problem is that in many parts of the world we only know about some of the languages or dialects in a region, But we don't know much about many of the dialects in between, so they could be separate languages, or they could also be linked by a chain of mutually intelligible dialects. Another issue is when social, cultural, or political criteria clash with linguistic criteria. Sometimes when a people group crosses borders, the single language they speak will be called different names in each country. For example, Danish and Swedish are the same language, but the people of Sweden call the language they speak Swedish, and the people of Denmark call the language they speak Danish, and these are the official names of the national languages of these countries. In other cases, several languages are treated as one language. Mandarin, Cantonese, Hakka and Hokkien are all officially treated as dialects of one language, Chinese, even though they're not mutually intelligible. So should these all be counted as one language? Or in Fiji, there are two indigenous languages, each separate dialect continuums, Western Fijian and Eastern Fijian, but all are usually referred to by their speakers and by the government as dialects of Fijian. Another reason it is difficult to accurately count the world's languages is because there are some complications with the idea of mutual intelligibility. One problem is that dialects that are part of the same continuum may have unequal relationships to one another. For example, Australians are used to hearing a lot of American English through movies and television, but most Americans have seen few, if any, Australian movies or television, or met Australians, so they are not used to hearing Australian English. Australians are more likely to understand Americans, but those same Americans might not be able to understand them. Another problem is that it's difficult to get a true understanding of how much mutual intelligibility there actually is, because there are often identity issues involved when people are asked if they understand or speak another language. For example, where there's a dominant language, speakers of the dominant language group might say that they do not understand the speech of the members of the non-dominant group. In many places in Africa, there may be several languages and dialects spoken in an area, but one will be more dominant than the others. Often, speakers of the subordinate languages will say they understand the more dominant one, but speakers of the dominant language will not admit to understanding any of the others. This situation follows directly from issues such as the economic and political dominance of the speakers of the dominant language. These attitudes are not unusual, which makes testing mutual intelligibility very difficult. The same pattern is found within the Scandinavian dialect continuum. Danes claim to be able to understand Norwegians much better than Norwegians claim to be able to understand Danes. So we've established that it's difficult to be accurate when counting the world's languages, but we do know that there are approximately 7,000 truly separate languages in the world. These are not distributed evenly, either geographically or in numbers of speakers. Some regions have a very high concentration of languages such as West Africa, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Amazonia and the Caucasus. Others have a low number of languages, so areas of low density are often areas where colonisation has taken place and a dominant language has become firmly established while others have been lost. If languages were distributed evenly, each language would have about 1 million speakers, but that is not the reality at all. The number of speakers of languages varies widely. A few languages have a great number of speakers, so 389 languages, 6% of the world's languages, have more than 1 million speakers. 94% of the world population speak only 6% of world languages, and just 6% of the world population speak 94% of the world's languages. So approximate numbers for the 10 languages with over 100 million speakers can be seen here on this slide. This chart simplifies what is a very complex picture, as each of these languages is actually a network of dialects. As we know, English is a large, complex dialect network. Arabic is a dialect continuum. Like Western Romance in Europe, it has some country-specific standard varieties. Speakers of Moroccan Arabic at one end of the continuum and speakers of Iraqi Arabic at the other end would not be able to understand each other, but there's no point between Morocco and Iraq where the chain of mutually intelligible dialects is broken. Many Arabic speakers also speak Classical Arabic, which links them. So if we count Arabic as one language and add up all its speakers, then to be consistent we should do the same with the European dialect continuums. We should really count Western Romance as one language with 715 million first language speakers. The language with the greatest number of speakers, referred to as Mandarin, consists of a huge number of dialects, many of which are not mutually intelligible. There are 8 main Mandarin dialects in mainland China, and each of these contains many other related dialects. In contrast to Mandarin and the other very large languages that we've just mentioned, most languages in the world have only a few thousand or even a few hundred speakers. Many have just a handful of very elderly speakers, like the Aboriginal language Gajirabang, which is spoken only by one elderly lady living in Western Australia. Estimates predict that between 50 and 90% of all languages in the world will die out within this century. It's estimated that on average, every 2 weeks, a language somewhere in the world falls into disuse.